By the time I reached the Siberian camp, I had already written 3 versions of the first incident report in my head. In the first version, nothing unusual had happened. The melt had uncovered some bones, the scientists were excited, the soldiers were bored, and I was a formality with a rank. I would tour the site, shake 1 or 2 hands for the cameras, file a dull summary for the ministry, and go home to a small flat and a chair that remembered my weight. In the second version, the team had found something obviously dangerous. Old warheads, a lost bunker with drums stacked to the ceiling, something with warning symbols that matched the archive photos. I knew exactly how that report would read. I had written that one more than once. The third version was for everything else. That one was always thin on details. Unstable conditions, ongoing assessment, recommend continued quarantine and restricted access until further notice. The words were a habit by now. They worked on nuclear sites, on plague storage facilities, on old gas test grounds, on villages we did not talk about anymore. I told myself this job would fit into one of those forms. It usually did. The snow crawler shuddered under me as we crept toward the camp. The driver kept his eyes on the faint poles that marked the route. The world outside the narrow forward window was a sheet of white, broken by occasional darker smears where the permafrost had sunk and torn itself open. The sky carried no color I could put a name to. It was just a presence overhead, flat and heavy. "You've been out here before, Comrade Colonel." He spoke without looking over. I watched his hands instead. Thick gloves on the control grips, small corrections, like a man guiding a nervous animal. "Further north, different project." That was all I gave him. He did not need to know that the ground under that other site had glowed on my detectors. He did not need to know what I had ordered the engineers to pour into those tunnels and what we had built over them afterward. He would not sleep better if I shared. We trundled around a shallow, frozen channel. Beyond it, the camp rose out of the white, low, dark modules on stilts, containers welded together into crude corridors, a few towers with lights that cut pale cones into the grey. A crane leaned over the far side, boom extended towards something I could not yet see. The driver thumped the crawler against the docking slot of the main module. I gathered my bag, checked the weight of the pistol in my holster out of habit rather than fear, and stepped through into the camp. Warmth hit first, then noise. Distant machinery, footsteps on metal floors, a voice cursing somewhere as a crate scraped a wall. There was always that sameness in these field stations. Corridors built from containers, walls made from panels that dented if you leaned too hard, doors that never quite closed the way they were supposed to. I could walk into any one of them and know where they had put the mess hall, the medical room, the communications shack, without reading a sign. My name was on the door to a small cabin near the command room. Colonel Igor Fomin, Project Liaison. I traced the raised letters with my gloved fingers for a moment before I went in. Someone had made an effort. They liked when the official presence had a name. I left the bag on the bunk and went straight to the command room. Oleg Sidorov met me there. He wore the kind of beard that tried to look older than its owner, dark and full but with patches of frost. As chief archaeologist, he technically commanded half the camp. The other half belonged to the security detachment. Officially, I was in charge of the whole thing. "Colonel Fomin." He moved around the table, hand extended, enthusiasm trying to punch through his tiredness. "You made good time. I did not expect you until tomorrow." Road was clear. I took his hand briefly. His grip had more confidence than strength. "You have something for me?" Oleg flicked a glance towards the far wall where a tall man in uniform leaned over a bank of monitors. Captain Pavel Remezov, security chief. He lifted his chin to acknowledge me, then turned his attention back to the screens. "We have many things for you, but one above all." He walked to the far bulkhead and brought up a satellite image on the wall monitor with a tap of his fingers. The picture showed a long, faint curve of grey against white, arcing across the terrain like a scar. "This is the wall, the segment we've uncovered so far." Thermal imaging and ground radar say it runs well beyond our perimeter. You called it a wall, I said. It was built. Constructed. Intentionally. It is not rock, it is bone. He tapped again. The image changed to a closer view, taken from a drone. The grey line resolved into shapes, skulls, enormous skulls, each almost as tall as a man, fused together in a long, uneven band. I had seen photographs in the briefing package, but seeing them across most of the wall filled the space in a different way. Rows of rounded domes, eye sockets like pits, jawbones locked into their neighbours. It looked like the boundary of some forgotten battlefield where giants had been arranged by a patient hand. "How close?" I asked. "Too close. Less than 50 meters from the camp at the nearest point. The meltwater is eating back the ice faster than we expected. Each day, more of the wall emerges." "You moved the camp?" He spread his hands. "We built here for the ground. Solid ice. No subsidence. We cannot just drag the modules away like sleds. And it is... Colonel, this is the find of a century. At least. Maybe more. We are documenting it as fast as we can." Of course they were. That was why I was here. "Walk me through. Then I'll read your logs." We took the outside ladder down. The cold hit like a slap, but it was a clean blow after the cramped corridors. They had laid metal walkways between modules, and we crossed them toward the crane. Men in insulated suits moved along the decks, hauling crates, stacking fuel drums, talking in short bursts that the wind shredded before they reached me. On one raised platform, a man in a pale coat smoked and stared out at the horizon, as if he expected the land itself to move. Beyond the crane, the ground fell away into a shallow cut where the ice had melted out and then refrozen unevenly. That was where I saw the wall properly for the first time. It rose from the earth in a ruined line, the upper half exposed, the lower half still locked in ice. Each skull was bigger than any animal head I knew, broad across the brow, with heavy cheekbones and massive curved jaws. The bone was discolored, ranging from yellowed white to almost black where mineral deposits had soaked in. In places it looked almost burned. The skulls were jammed together without mortar, temple to temple, jaw to dome, as if a huge hand had taken each head and pressed it into place until the bones deformed. In some spots the pressure had cracked them, leaving narrow gaps where ice peered through like glass. Closer to our side, metal scaffolding hugged the wall. Men moved along the frames, scraping, brushing, photographing, carving out samples with electric saws. A work light on a pole glared against the bone, picking out the tool marks. Oleg watched me watch it. "You see why we asked for you," he said quietly. "This was not an accident of geology. Someone did this. Someone who could lift and shape heads that size. Or a machine. A machine could do it." He snorted, amused without humor. "You think this was a military project? I think my ministry sends me when there's a chance some forgotten ministry did something stupid in the past. Show me the inside." He led me down a metal staircase to the base of the wall. Up close, the skulls were even more unnerving. They were the right proportions to be human, scaled up. The eye sockets were wide and deep, the nasal opening broad. The teeth were blunt and heavy, more like grinding blocks than fangs, but there was nothing reassuring in that. Near the center of this section, they had cut a window into one skull. A vertical slice, then another, then the piece of bone lowered out with the crane and laid on a sled nearby. The opening was almost big enough for a man to climb through. A set of floodlights stared in. The inside of the skull was not smooth, it was carved. Oleg stepped closer, careful of the frozen ground underfoot. "Look here. These channels, these drilled cavities, the regular spacing." I stepped in beside him and peered through. Narrow grooves scored the inner surface of the cranial dome, running in curves and crosses like a map. Each groove was about as wide as my thumb, with a consistent depth. Between them, small round holes had been bored through, not all the way to the outside, but deep enough that dark spots showed where something had once been plugged in. They match across several skulls. Same pattern, same measurements. We cut one away entirely, and there were traces of fibrous material, for lack of a better word, not natural ligaments. It is as if something once ran through every one of these holes and grooves, connecting all of them together. Wires. You're describing wires. An ancient equivalent, perhaps. I do not know. That is why I asked for a geophysicist, and why the ministry gave me one, and why they gave me you. If someone built this, it might be a containment structure, or a conduit, or both. Containment. That was the word that anchored itself. That was a language I understood. I traced one carved groove with a gloved finger through the cutout. It curved gently, then turned sharply, connecting two of the drilled cavities. I could imagine some long evaporated cable sitting there, carrying whatever passed for a signal in whatever passed for a brain that big. You cut how many? I asked. 3 full skulls, dozens of partial slices, enough to see the pattern. And each time you slice into it, you disconnect another part of whatever network this was. He looked up sharply. Do you think we should stop? I watched the men on the scaffolding, the crane operator, the techs with cameras. I thought of how many eyes were already on this project, universities, ministries, foreign agencies sniffing at the edges of the data stream, eager for any sign of something to claim. We'll see. For now, keep working, but anything strange, any incident, any man injured or behaving oddly, you bring straight to me. Oleg's brows drew together. It is a dig, Colonel. People get tired, they slip, someone gets a broken wrist, someone loses focus. You cannot shut us down every time. I can shut you down. I didn't raise my voice, just placed the words. And I will if I have to. You want this to continue, you bring me problems early. Don't try to manage them out of sight. He hesitated, then nodded once. We will bring you problems early. Good. I stepped back from the carved skull. Then we start with housing. I want to know who sleeps where, who shares with whom, and how close your bunks are to this wall. He blinked. To the wall? Why would I think better when I have a map? I lied. It was close enough to the truth. I spent the rest of the day walking the camp. I met Dr. Armen Grigorian, the medic, who looked at me over his glasses and mentally weighed me on a scale that had nothing to do with rank. I met Viktor Kolesnik, the geophysicist, hunched over screens in a cramped module, tracing lines across an abstract representation of the subsurface with a stylus. I met Timur Sagan, the local drill operator and guide, whose handshake was short and whose gaze kept drifting to the window and the land beyond. I learned the schedule: breakfast at a fixed time. Work shifts staggered so that at any moment, half the camp was on duty, half off. A single communication shack with a satellite antenna locked into a secure band that ran through my ministry before it touched the wider world. Security patrols around the perimeter, mostly for show. They feared bears and foreign drones more than anything else. By evening, I knew where everything and everyone was supposed to be. That was always the first step in taking responsibility for a place. You draw the inside of it into your head until you can close your eyes and walk it without looking. That night, I slept in my cabin and met the giant. It started as the usual slide into unconsciousness. I lay on the narrow bunk, boots under the frame, pistol within reach out of habit. The generator thumped somewhere in the camp, a steady rhythm that I let my thoughts lean against until they blurred. Then the generator rhythm changed. It became footfalls, heavy, measured footfalls through something soft that compressed under each step. Snow. Not the packed surface around the camp decks, but an open field of it, deep and loose. Each movement sank me to mid-shin, then I lifted out easily, as if my legs were pistons built for exactly this resistance. My vantage point was wrong. Too high. My arms hung further below me than they should. I looked down and saw hands the size of spades, fingers thick as tool handles. The sky overhead matched the one outside, flat and without hue. The land around was open, gently rolling. In the distance, a line of darker shapes moved quickly. Smaller figures, human-sized. They ran in jerks, kicking up trails behind them. I followed, There was no decision. My body was already in motion, carrying me toward them with long, effortless steps. Each stride covered ground that would have taken several seconds of running at my usual height. The distance closed. The smaller men looked over their shoulders, mouths open, faces pale. They carried simple weapons, spears, slings, bows with bone-tipped arrows. One stumbled, went to one knee, tried to push back to his feet. My hand closed around him. Fingers wrapped his torso entirely. His arms flailed uselessly against my knuckles. He kicked and clawed, more like a hooked fish than a man. Some part of me was watching from far away, noting his clothing, the make of his boots, the way the seams were sewn. Another part was very close, registering the struggle, the strain in my fingers, the desire to squeeze until the movement stopped. I squeezed. There was resistance, then give. Bones failing. The body in my grip jerked, then sagged. The other small figures scattered. My body took one long step and lifted another in the same way. It felt like sweeping a street, clearing rubble. The sensation was familiar. I had known it in villages with mud streets and stone houses, though my hands had held rifles then, not human bodies. The dream did not end with the hunt. It continued with a march. Many giants my size moved across the land in a line. The low sky pressed down on their shoulders. Around them, small shapes darted, fought, fell. The sequence repeated, almost mechanical. Step, reach, crush, drop, step. I woke in my bunk with my teeth clenched and my hands half closed as if I were still holding something. My jaw hurt as if I had been clenching it for hours. The cabin was dark, except for a thin strip of light under the door. The generator beat came back into its own rhythm, slower than the dream footfalls, but close enough to confuse my senses for a moment. I lay still and listened. Nothing out of place. No shouting, no alarm. It was just a dream then. A vivid one, yes. But I had known vivid dreams before. Men who had done my kind of work did not sleep cleanly. You learned to treat it as weather. It came and went, and in the morning you still had reports to write. I swung my legs off the bunk, sat, and focused on slow movements until my breathing matched the rhythm I wanted. The urge to walk down to the wall right then and stare at the skulls in the floodlights pressed against my ribs. I did not indulge it. Curiosity in the middle of the night was no friend to anyone in a place like this. Instead, I noted the dream in the private part of my mind where I kept all the other things that could not go in paperwork, and I went back to sleep. The first death came 2 nights later. By then, I had seen 3 minor missteps. A worker who had drifted off halfway through a shift, mind elsewhere. A tech who snapped at a colleague over nothing, face grey with exhaustion. Arman, the medic, grumbling that sleep patterns were skewed and the workload was too heavy. Shift work. He stabbed at his food in the mess hall. People are not meant to live like this for long stretches. Out here, the sun makes its own decisions, and we pretend clocks can win the argument. Give me more sedatives or fewer working hours, or the camp will start biting itself. We cannot cut hours, Oleg objected from his spot at the table. The ice is melting faster than expected. Every day, another slice of wall appears. If we do not record it now, it will collapse and we will lose the context forever. You cannot drink photographs. Arman pushed his plate away. You cannot keep a man going on a bone collection when his body wants a week in a real bed. I gave them a small portion of attention while I ate, enough to register their concerns, not enough to invite them deeper. The truth was simple. No one would approve fewer working hours until something broke in a way that could not be argued away. That was the way of every ministry. Something broke that night. Pavel knocked on my cabin door at some hour that had not yet earned a name. I opened to find him standing there in full uniform, coat unbuttoned in his haste, eyes locked into that flat stare soldiers get when they have walked over a line in their head and do not know if they can get back. Colonel. His voice stayed low, but urgency carried. We have an incident. I pulled on my coat and followed him outside. The air hit like a wall, cold enough that each inhale scraped the back of my throat. The camp looked smaller at night, the modules hunched together, the light from the towers blasting clear cones down onto the metal walkways and leaving the spaces between in deep shade. The body lay between two modules, half on the walkway, half over the edge. A smear of red marked the steel and then disappeared into the trampled snow below. Two soldiers stood nearby with their rifles slung, stunned more than ready. Armin knelt over the body. He did not look up as we approached. His hands moved, checking for any residual signs of life, even though he already knew there were none. "Who is he?" I asked. "Artur Klenov, drill team, 30s, no disciplinary record, no medical issues beyond a shoulder strain last month." Artur's face was scarcely recognizable. One side flattened, the other torn, as if something huge had closed around his head and squeezed. His neck lay at an angle that suggested at least one vertebra had simply given up. I crouched and studied the injuries more closely. I had seen heads hit by falling rubble, crushed by vehicles, pulped by explosions. This did not look like that. The pattern was too focused, as if pressure had come from a single grip rather than a random strike. Armin straightened and met my eyes. "Nothing to be done. He's been gone for some time. An hour, maybe more. Who found him?" "One of my men on patrol," Pavel said. "He's in my office if you want to talk to him, but he will not be able to tell you much." "Why not?" "Because he did not notice the body until he tripped over it." He spoke more as we walked to the command room. The patrol route passed this corridor every 30 minutes. The guard in question had walked it twice in the last hour. On the second pass, his foot had caught Artur's arm, and he had gone down with a shout that roused the nearby workers. "You're sure the man wasn't there the first time?" I asked. "We checked the camera. You should see this." He queued up a recording from an exterior camera that covered the corridor between the two modules. The timestamp crawled across the top of the frame in pale digits. The image showed an empty walkway, the tower light glaring down, the shadow of the railing inked onto the steel. "This is 20 minutes before discovery." A figure walked into frame from the left. Not Artur, a different worker, shorter, broad in the shoulders, wearing standard cold weather gear with the hood up. He crossed the walkway slowly, both hands hanging at his sides. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead. No acknowledgement of the camera, no glance toward the modules. "Who is that?" I asked. Pavel tapped a key, bringing up a personnel overlay. "Andrei Lukin, drill team, Artur's bunkmate." We watched as Andrei paused near the center of the frame, swayed slightly, then turned toward the gap between the modules. He stepped off the walkway, disappeared from view for a moment, and then reappeared, dragging a limp shape. Artur. Andrei moved with a kind of unhurried determination. He hauled Artur's body onto the walkway by the shoulders, then placed his hands on Artur's head. The angle of the camera was poor, but it was enough. We saw his arms tense. We saw the jerk in his posture as something gave under his hands. I watched myself from outside as I leaned in. The stance, the way Andrei's weight settled over the grip, the small adjustment of his feet to brace for the effort. I had seen that posture in the mirror when I handled someone in close quarters and space was tight. Andrei dropped Artur back onto the metal and stood for a moment. He did not look around. He did not wipe his hands. He simply turned and walked out of frame. "What did the patrol see?" I asked. "On the previous pass, nothing. The walkway was clear. On this one, he trips, looks down, and we get the rest." He flipped to the second clip. The guard stumbling, the discovery, the shout, the rush of bodies into the corridor. "Where's Lukin now?" I asked. "In the infirmary. When they dragged him in, he was shaking and babbling. Now he insists he remembers nothing, says he went to bed in his bunk and woke up with you and me standing over him." The word drifted through my mind without my permission. "Sleepwalking. Any history of that?" "None in his file. He's not the only one complaining about bad dreams, though. Half the camp grumbles about them now." Of course they did. Men who worked long hours in a hostile environment, surrounded by skulls of unknown origin and size, would have bad dreams. That was normal. Some would grind their teeth. Some would mutter in their sleep. And sometimes in all remote camps, someone snapped and picked a fight. Only this had not looked like a snapped fight. It had looked like a practiced kill. Full lockdown, curfew enforced. No one walks alone at night. Anyone with serious sleep disturbance goes on a list, and Arman sees each one. Lukin in a separate room, restraints if needed. Only Arman and one guard at a time in reach. Pavel studied me. You think this is a contagion, Colonel? Some kind of pathogen? If I thought that, you'd already be in masks and plastic. We don't know what this is. We do know one man crushed another man's head and claims he slept through it. Temporary madness, stress, confined conditions. Temporary madness rarely performs a technique that cleanly. He looked back at the frozen frame where Lukin's arms were braced around Arta's head. His throat moved. You've seen that before? Yes. In villages a long way from here, under circumstances I don't care to revisit. But there the men swinging their arms were awake. I spent the rest of the night writing my first real report. The first version died on the page after 2 sentences. The second version collapsed under the weight of what the camera had shown. The third took shape slowly. Unexplained fatality under unusual behavioral conditions. Subject Lukin appears to have been in a dissociative or altered state at the time of the act. Recommend temporary quarantine and psychological monitoring while further data collected. I did not mention my own dream. That stayed in the separate ledger in my head. I slept for perhaps 2 hours when I was done. The giant was waiting. This time the dream began mid-stride. My body was already moving across the open land. The small figures ahead were closer. I could almost make out their faces. I recognized one. Artur. He looked over his shoulder, and the features I had seen crushed on the walkway were still whole, still animated, stretched with effort. His mouth opened in a shout I could not hear. My hand reached for him. I woke seconds before I closed my grip. My hands had closed around the blanket instead, twisting it, compressing the fabric into tight rolls. My chest ached, as if I had been running. I sat up, swung my legs off the bunk, and stared at the wall until the image of the giant's hand faded enough that I could trust my own fingers. I told myself it was because I had seen the recording before sleep. The mind replayed what it had watched. Old training and older guilt colored the dream. That was all. The next day, 3 more men reported the same dream. They did not come to me directly. They complained to Arman first. He collared me in the narrow corridor outside his medical module, his coat stained with something dark brown. You knew this was happening, he said. You did not think to mention it. I looked past him into the ward. Lukin lay on a cot, wrists and ankles bound to metal rails with webbing straps. His eyes followed something no one else could see across the ceiling. I knew one man committed a murder in his sleep. I didn't know everyone was sharing his dreams. Not his, something else's. He dragged me inside and jerked his chin at a clipboard on the counter. Read. I skimmed his notes. Worker after worker describing a dream of moving in a body that was too large, under a blank sky, chasing small figures across snow. Some details varied, but the structure stayed the same. Height, weight, the sense of power, the predatory focus, the act of crushing or tearing. Lukin? Same pattern before he killed Klenov. He didn't tell anyone then, but he mentioned it after. He thought he was just losing his mind like the rest of us. The rest of us? I asked, then understood. You've had it too. Twice now. Arman rubbed the bridge of his nose with ink-stained fingers. You? Yes, 2 nights. We stood for a moment in silence. Lukin's restraints creaked as he strained against them, muscles working, face slack. This is not a simple stress dream, Arman said quietly. The detail, the shared elements, the way it spreads. I am listening to grown men describe lifting bodies with one hand, and tearing them apart like bread. They wake shaking and ashamed. I thought of my own hands, the blanket twisted between them. Proximity to the wall. Do the men who work closest report it more? For now, yes, but the line is not clean. A communications operator had it last night, and he spends most of his time in the shack. One of Victor's assistants, who barely leaves geophysics, had it as well. It spreads along social lines as well as physical ones. Stories, descriptions, they prime the mind. We stand next to a wall of giant skulls all day. Of course we go to bed thinking of giants. Of course we dream that way. Armand studied me, eyes narrow. You do not believe that. I'm required to act as if I'm not yet convinced. He exhaled sharply. What do you want from me, Colonel? I can give sedatives to half the camp, but that won't fix the cause. It will only make them easier to do whatever this thing wants while they sleep. This thing, I repeated. You already think it's a thing. You dream as a giant chasing humans across the snow, 2 nights running, while working next to a ring of giant skulls wired together for some unknown purpose. And you tell me there is nothing here but coincidence. Either we are witnessing the biggest shared psychosis in fieldwork history, or something is pushing into our heads when we lie down. He was not wrong. I did not like being pushed into the position of slow skeptic, but someone had to occupy it. Panic spread faster than any illness. Document everything. Start with the worst cases. I want names, bunks, work assignments, precise times of onset, medications, any hallucinogenic history. See if there's a pattern we can use. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we treat the camp like a nuclear site with a leak. We contain exposure as much as we can while we figure out what's coming through the cracks. I added to that quietly. And we watch the wall. Victor came to me that afternoon with new data. The geophysicist rarely left his module, but when he did, he carried his tablet like a shield. I've been mapping under the wall. His fingers already moved to bring up images. You see this? The screen showed a cross-section of the terrain under our feet, color-coded bands marking different densities. I had learned enough over the years to read the basics. Darker bands for denser material, lighter for less. The skull wall appeared as an irregular, jagged line, denser than the surrounding ice, but less dense than rock. Here, Victor tapped a band behind the wall, deeper under the ice. This region shows as lower density than it should, foamy almost, as if there are empty spaces, like an old mine with many tunnels. But there is no sign of void collapse. A natural cave system? He shook his head. Too regular. Look. He zoomed in. The lighter band resolved into a striated structure, curving along the same arc as the wall. It looked like the inside of a ring, hollow but reinforced. The skulls sit on the outer edge. Behind them, something else runs along the same line. Less dense than bone, but not just ice. It does not behave like frozen water on the scanner. The signal is corrupted. You think it's another structure, a void lined with something. He nodded. And when Oleg's team cut that skull loose 2 days ago, we saw a change here. He flicked back and forth between 2 scans. Microtremors, very small but not random. Something behind the wall reacted when the connection broke. Reaction how? The instruments registered tiny vibrations, not from the ground above, but from this band behind, like tapping on a drum skin from the inside. He caught himself, embarrassed by his own metaphor. Or like something shifting in a box. The image of the giant dream rose in my mind again. The march, the hunting line, the way the ground had offered no resistance. Something in the box indeed. Do the men who work near this section dream more? My assistant keeps a tally. It seems so. But correlation is not proof. The whole camp shares stories. Keep scanning. Watch for any changes when the archaeologists cut deeper. I want to know if whatever's behind that wall responds to anything we do. And if it does, then we consider whether to stop. I did not add, or whether to make sure the stopping happens in a way that leaves the ministry the option of denial. The second outbreak made that question more urgent. It began with storm warnings. The forecast from the satellite link showed a massive cloud moving in from the northwest, winds high enough to threaten the antenna. We locked down external work early that day, pulled men off the scaffolds and into the modules, lashed loose equipment. By nightfall, the camp shook under gusts that rattled every loose panel. The tower lights swung, their beams sweeping over the wall and the surrounding drifts in slow arcs. The generator load spiked and dipped. The communications line crackled, then went dead for a moment before stabilizing. I had been through worse in other places. Weather rarely killed a site built with even minimal competence. What concerned me more was the way the storm would box us in. No helicopter could reach us now. No ground convoy could cross the sinkholes without visibility. For at least 2 days, we were an island. I went to bed with that thought and woke in the giant again. This time, the dream opened not in open tundra, but inside a space. I stood in a tunnel large enough for my enormous body to move through. The walls were bone, smooth and curving, close enough that I could reach out and brush my fingers along either side as I walked. Grooves cut the inner surface. Small cavities pocked the bone like a pattern of wells. The feel of the air on my face told me this space was not outside. No wind, no cold. Ahead, light. Not firelight. A steady glow from somewhere beyond a bend. I moved toward it, each step measured. The floor under my massive feet was made of something hard and irregular, like a mesh of bones and stones fused together. At intervals, smaller shapes lined the walls. Human-sized bodies slumped in carved niches, heads wired into the bone behind them with straps and cords. Their eyes were closed, their chests rose and fell. They were alive, and they were dreaming. I reached one without deciding to. Its head rested in a shallow depression, the skull back opened carefully. Fine rods connected the exposed brain to the grooves in the wall, slipping into drilled holes that matched the ones we had seen in the giant skulls outside. Its face was calm. My hand reached down and brushed its cheek. No resistance. It could not feel me. The scene jumped. I was outside again, standing over the wall we now walked beside with our small human bodies. I looked down at the line of fused skulls. In the distance, I could see others like me lifting living giants by chains anchored to their necks and fitting their heads into gaps on the wall, like men placing stones. Smaller figures moved around their feet, directing them. I woke with my heart racing. This time, I did not stay in bed. I threw on clothes and went straight to the command room. The night duty operator looked up as I entered. His eyes were ringed with dark circles. He opened his mouth to greet me, but the lights cut out with a snap before he could. The screens went black. The hum of electronics vanished. Only the dull thud of the generator remained. For a moment, we both stood frozen in the dark. Then emergency strips along the floor flicked on, casting a low glow along the walkways. Power relay tripped again. The operator muttered, "I will reset it." He stood, stretched, and staggered slightly. I caught his shoulder. "Stay sharp," I told him. "Tonight is not the night for sleepwalking." He gave a short, humorless laugh and moved to the panel. By the time the main power came back, the screaming had started. It came over the internal channel first, a burst of static, then a voice shouting, words breaking. "On C deck, he's got a wrench. He is tearing into—" The rest dissolved under noise. I grabbed the handset. "Security to C deck now, and get me Remezov." Pavel arrived in seconds, uniform thrown on over thermal underwear, hair flattened on one side. He did not ask what was happening. He just took one of the spare rifles from the rack and checked the chamber. We moved into the corridor together. The storm outside made the whole structure shiver. The tower lights, running on a separate circuit, swung wildly. Shadows sliced across the walls. We reached C deck and the first scene of damage. A door hung open, its control panel dented from a heavy blow. Inside, two men lay on the floor, one groaning with a hand pressed to his side, the other not moving at all. Blood pooled under him, slick and dark. "Who did this?" Pavel demanded, already moving past them. The groaning man lifted his head weakly and pointed down the corridor. "Yura. He walked in with the wrench and—" A shout cut him off. Metal against metal, then a heavy thump, then another. We ran toward the sounds. Yura was a mechanic. I had met him once in the mess, his hands stained with machine grease, ready to complain about parts shortages. In that moment in the corridor, he was something else entirely. He stood over another fallen man, arm lifted high. In his hand, a torque wrench glinted in the harsh light. It was the kind used to tighten heavy bolts on rigging. His clothes hung crooked, his boots were untied. His hood had fallen back, revealing a slack face and unfocused eyes. He brought the wrench down with a precise, measured swing on the back of the man's neck. There was a crack. The body jerked once. Yura lifted the wrench again. "Stop!" He did not react. Not to my voice, not to the crash of boots behind us, not to the rifle Pavel leveled. "Shoot his arm!" Pavel fired. The shot slammed into Yura's upper arm, spinning him sideways. The wrench clanged against the floor. Yura staggered, looked down as if surprised by the sudden color on his sleeve, and then looked up at us. His eyes focused. His knees buckled. They hit the deck hard. He tried to push himself up once, hands slipping on blood, then slumped. Arman arrived seconds later, medical bag banging against his hip. He slid next to the downed bodies, hands already working. The report from that night took me an hour to write and 3 to edit. By morning, we had 7 injured, 3 dead, and most of the camp in a state that hovered between mutiny and collapse. The pattern was clear. Men were dropping into that giant dream, and some were not coming all the way back when they woke. We pulled everyone not essential to immediate survival into the mess hall. I stood at one end of the room, near the coffee urn, with Pavel on one side and Oleg on the other. Arman lingered at the back, watching the faces instead of the speaker. "This is not a ghost story," I began. "Not a curse, not punishment from the land. Whatever is happening because of something physical in this place interacting with your brains." It was not the most reassuring opening, but these were not children. We are working on 3 tracks. First, medical. Dr. Gregorian and I are identifying those most affected. They'll be sedated under supervision until we understand more. Mutters rippled through the room. No one liked the idea of being put under intentionally in a camp where sleep itself had become suspect. Second, archaeology. Dr. Sidorov's team will focus on the wall. The carvings inside the skulls, the traces of whatever was wired through them. We need to know what this was for. Oleg straightened slightly. Third, geophysics. Kolesnik is mapping the subsurface behind the wall. Early data says there is more there than ice and stone. Something reacts when we cut those skulls. We need to know what we're poking. In the meantime, new rules. I lifted a hand, ticking them off with my fingers. I did not trust myself to speak the numbers. No one sleeps alone. You share a room and wake each other if there's movement that doesn't belong. No one walks the corridors without a partner, especially at night. Anyone who gets the dream more than once reports to Arman immediately, no matter how ashamed you are of what you did in it. An excavation on the wall slows down. We still work, we still record, but we cut fewer skulls until we understand the consequences. I'll enforce this if I have to. Those of you who think this is a mistake can put your opinions in a letter to the ministry after you get home alive. There were no cheers, just faces, pale and pinched, trying to decide whether they could trust me or anyone. After the meeting, Timur pulled me aside near the door. "You will not fix this with rules," he told me in a low tone. "That wall is older than you, older than your ministry. It was not meant to be opened. Older doesn't mean smarter. Old people did plenty of stupid things. This was not stupid." His gaze slid toward the skulls. My grandfather spoke of big bones out on the tundra and stories from his grandfather before that. hunters who went too far north and came back wrong or not at all. No one listened to them either. I'm listening now. I'm also watching men kill each other in their sleep. I'll use any tool I have, including rules. They built that to keep something in. You cut into it. Of course it pushes back. He walked away before I could answer. Over the next days, the camp settled into a strained rhythm. We enforced the new rules. Extra guards on night shift, paired patrols, bunk checks. Men slept in groups. Blankets spread on floors if there were not enough beds. Armen dispensed sedatives sparingly, monitoring each patient's response. The dreams did not stop. They became more detailed. In mine, the scenes inside the bone tunnels lengthened. I saw more of the smaller figures wired into the walls, their skulls open, their brains linked by rods and cords into a network along the curve. They were not giants. They were the prey from earlier dreams, the human-sized runners. Now they sat in niches, hooked into a system that let something feed on their dreams forever. I began to wake with the sense, not of having been inside the giant body, but of looking through its eyes at a structure built by others. I did not share those details with the camp. I did share them with my hidden report to the ministry. I wrote that something at the site appeared to be inducing shared dreams with predatory content, and that further excavation revealed evidence of modification of the skulls. I included Victor's scans and Oleg's notes. I left out the part where, after each night's dream, the next day's outbreak seemed to fit into a pattern I had glimpsed while sleeping. The entity, I had begun to think of it that way privately, was not random in its attacks. It favored men who had been near the latest cut in the wall, but it also seemed to jump along social lines. A worker who shared a bunk with an affected man, but had not yet worked on the wall himself, might wake in the act of strangling his partner. A communications operator who had only ever seen the skulls on a monitor might wake with his hands around his own throat, nails digging into his skin. Each time I dreamed, I saw the wall from different angles. Each time I woke with a sense of impending incidents in specific parts of the camp. Not precise, not like a map, but close enough that my gut told me where to send extra guards, where to station Pavel's men with stun batons in addition to rifles. When I listened to that instinct, we stopped some incidents earlier. We pulled a knife from a man's hand before he reached his bunkmate's bed. We caught another halfway across the open yard, moving toward the skull wall in bare feet despite the cold. Each interception involved shouting, wrestling, bruises. Men woke confused and wept, or they woke furious and humiliated, but fewer died on those nights. My mind liked that pattern. It stroked my old training: gather intelligence, predict threats, deploy assets, a neat loop. The entity liked it too. I realized that one morning as I watched a replay from a helmet camera. The camera belonged to one of Pavel's men, assigned to walk the corridor between the main accommodation block and the medical module while the rest of us slept. In the recording, the view drifted down the length of the corridor, then jerked as the guard turned at a noise. Ahead, a figure lurched from a doorway, eyes glazed, a wrench dangling from loose fingers. Before he could take more than 3 steps, 2 other guards emerged from side passages, moving in from either side. The camera view jumped as the wearer rushed in. Batons cracked down on the sleepwalker's arms and shoulders. He went down in a tangle of limbs, the wrench clanging away. The guards pinned him until Armen arrived with a sedative. We had prevented another murder. Good. A win. But as I replayed the footage, I noticed more. The man who had walked out of his bunk to do something terrible had not been alone in that room. 2 bunks side by side. Another man slept on his back, mouth open, oblivious. If the sleepwalker had been allowed to reach him, the entity would have tasted that shock, that instant when dream and waking met in violence. It fed on that. That was obvious by now. We had denied it that moment. Instead, we had given it something else. The man strapped to the medical bed later that morning sedated against his will, would lie there, half-conscious, trapped between dream and waking. His brain would stew in fear and helpless rage. The entity would find that too. It would prod at him, learn how he responded. We had not starved it, we had changed its diet. The thought slid into my mind with a cold familiarity. I knew what it felt like when an adversary adapted to my moves. In old operations, you learned quickly that pressing harder on an enemy could give them more recruits. Kill one man, and 3 of his cousins picked up rifles. Lock one down, and he became a martyr in confinement. Here, something we could not see was watching us apply containment measures and adjusting to them. I did not share that thought with the camp. Instead, I called Oleg and Victor into my cabin, closed the door, and opened a bottle I had brought from the city. Not because I particularly wanted a drink, but because men spoke more freely when their hands held something stronger than coffee. Oleg dropped into the spare chair, Kane propped beside him. He had banged his knee on the wall scaffolding earlier that week and had been limping since. Victor hovered near the small desk, tablet hugged to his chest like a life raft. I asked you here because I need your best guesses, not your professional caution. We'll move carefully later. For now, tell me what you think this wall was built for, and what might be behind it. Oleg exchanged a look with Victor. You want the fairy tale version, he said. The thing we write down only if we find proof later. I nodded. He took a sip, then leaned forward. We have 2 main possibilities. Either the giants built this wall, wiring their own skulls together for some purpose, or someone else did it to them. Empires sometimes build walls from the skulls of their enemies. Yes, as trophies. But they do not usually carve channels on the inside of each one and drill precise holes in the same pattern, then arrange them in a ring that matches an anomaly underground. That suggests function, not ornament. So you lean toward the second option. The giants were tools. Captives. Think of them as livestock. Something hunted them or feared them or both. A smaller species took them alive, arranged them, wired their brains together and used them as components in a machine. A machine for what? I asked, though I had already started to suspect. Victor answered, for holding something in place. The way we use a ring of monitors and safety systems to keep a reactor under control. The way you build a blast wall around something that must never fail. He tapped his tablet and brought up a schematic. A ring. The outer band formed by the skull wall. The inner band by the low-density anomaly under the ice. Whatever lies in this inner region was surrounded by giants whose brains were wired into the bone. The grooves and holes you saw inside the skulls are consistent with a network designed to channel activity between them. Dreams, I murmured. Exactly. Oleg sat back. They took the fiercest thing around, something that hunted them without mercy, and used its own fear and rage. They caught it, clamped its head into the wall, hooked its mind into a loop with others like it, and forced it to run through its nightmares forever. That noise would drown out anything trying to reach in from inside the ring, a barrier made of predators repurposed as a baffle. You're describing a prison? Yes. Oleg lifted his glass. A prison built by prey who became wardens. They turned the giants into guards who never slept off duty because sleeping was the job. And then the guards died, I said. Bodies rotted, brains dissolved, cables decayed, circuits broke. Only the skulls remained. Victor nodded. The system has been failing for a long time, but the ice helped. It froze everything in place, physically and maybe otherwise. Now the permafrost melts, the skulls crack, we cut through the remnants of the connections and whatever is behind the ring finds new brains to lean on. Ours. It pushes when we cut. You saw the microtremors. And each time we remove another skull, the band behind shows more activity. I thought of the giant dreams, of the bone tunnels, of the smaller figures wired into niches, prey turned into parts. You think the smaller species wired themselves in too, to maintain the baffle after the giants died? Perhaps. Or they wired prisoners, dissidents, criminals, people like the ones your ministry has quietly removed over the years. He glanced at me. I let the barb slide. You mock, but you may not be far wrong. Our predecessors might have learned you can make prisoners guard a prison by trapping them inside their own nightmares. It sounds familiar enough. We sat in silence for a moment. So, what's behind the wall now? I asked. How do we name it? Oleg shook his head. I have no word that would help. It is not a creature you can point to. It is a pattern, a habit, a hunger, maybe, that uses dreams as hands. Call it a predator, and you make it sound simple. A predator that can only move when people sleep, Victor added. One that needs violent dreams to extend itself, like branches seeking new soil. When the baffle worked, it kept its focus tied to the ring. Now the ring is broken, and we gave it a new path through the camp. And I gave it a better one. By separating the worst cases, locking them away, I made perfect cages of fear and helplessness for it to circle. You contained the problem you could see, Oleg said. That is your job. Yes, and jobs like mine often involve choosing which problem to feed. When they left, I sat alone in my cabin for a long time. The storm outside had calmed, leaving a strange stillness. The skull wall loomed in my thoughts, not just as a structure of bone, but as a broken device, a ruined ring around a pit of old hunger. The ministry had not responded to my last report beyond an acknowledgement of receipt. That was normal. They would convene a committee, have their experts debate my words, and send back instructions in a day or two. By then, whatever lived behind the wall might already have more of us wired into its loop. That night, I did not sleep willingly. I took one of Armand's sedatives and lay down with the knowledge that I was walking myself straight into the entity's workspace. It greeted me like an old colleague. The dream did not bother with giants at first. It placed me directly in the bone tunnel. I walked between rows of human-sized sleepers. Their skulls were opened, their brains linked by rods to the grooves in the wall. The rods vibrated gently, like strings on a plucked instrument. Each sleeper twitched, eyes moving under lids. Their dreams flowed along the channels into something deeper inside the structure. As I moved, I realized that some of the faces were not ancient strangers. They were men from the camp. Yura, Lukin, Artur, alive again. Others I knew by sight but not name. Each lay in his niche, head wired in, body slack. I stopped in front of Yura. His face was calm, younger without the grease and grit. The rods connected to his brain glowed faintly like warm metal. As I watched, the channels feeding from his niche brightened. Somewhere deeper in the wall, something responded. There was no visible creature, no hand reaching out, no mouth opening, just a sense of attention shifting. It noticed that I was watching. In that instant, the dream changed. I saw the camp layout overlaid on the bone tunnel in a way that made too much sense. Corridors became grooves, bunks became niches. The wall itself sat where the skull ring did. My men lay in their beds like the ancient sleepers in their niches, minds plugged into the entity's reach through their shared nightmares. I woke with the image burned into my thoughts. Containment was not a metaphor here. It was literal. We had taken a failing ancient prison and parked a temporary modern camp right against its broken wall. We slept there in lines, conveniently prearranged like a new ring for the entity to latch onto. If I did nothing, the thing behind the wall would eventually find the paths it needed. It would reach through us to the next group of humans we contacted, then the next, until its influence traveled along flight paths and digital channels instead of bone grooves. Every sleeper with a mind full of fear and violence would be a new niche in its tunnel. If I did something, the options were worse. I could order an evacuation, move everyone as far away from the wall as possible. That would pull dozens of men who already hosted the entity's touch into planes and trucks and trains. we would carry our contamination straight back to cities and towns. The first outbreaks in civilian homes would be blamed on stress, mental illness, random crime. By the time anyone linked them, it would be too late. I could order them all shot. The thought arrived cleanly. No drama, a line of men against the wall, rifles raised, a terrible duty justified by a greater threat. I knew how to give that order. I had given cousins to it in other contexts, but that would not work either. The entity did not rely on muscle and bone. It used patterns in the flesh, electrical storms in brains. Killing a man did not erase his dreams from the network immediately. It might even give the entity a last intense flare of fear to chew on. And then, whatever remained behind the wall would still be there, waiting for the next group of fools to dig it out. The only option that resembled the ancient solution was the worst one. Rebuild the baffle. I needed a ring of sleepers near the breach, their brains arranged to form a crude, dense barrier of activity that would keep the entity busy, running through the same nightmares again and again, too distracted to extend its reach further. The ancient prey had used giants and then their own kind. I had men. I spent the next day testing the thought against reality. Practically, it meant selecting a subset of the camp, sedating them, positioning their beds in a ring as close to the wall as the structure allowed, and wiring them to our own monitoring equipment. We had portable headsets that measured brainwaves. Armin had brought them for a side experiment on sleep patterns under extreme conditions. They used electrodes, simple contact pads to read the electrical activity on the scalp. If we linked those in a certain pattern, we might be able to concentrate the entity's grip in that ring. Morally, it meant choosing who would spend the rest of their lives as components in a prison, if the prison held at all. I took the idea to Armin first. He listened without interrupting, expression shutting down as I described the ancient baffle and my proposal for a new one. "You are asking me," he said when I finished, "to turn my patients into bait and leave them hanging over an old well. I'm asking you to help keep this from marching down flight routes to the cities. We can evacuate some of the camp once the ring is in place. Not all. Enough to warn others quietly. Enough to seal off the area on paper as a contamination zone no one is allowed to enter. And the ones you leave? You'll give me names, and I'll tie them to beds and watch their eyes roll under closed lids until they die from neglect. No. You'll sedate them properly. Feed them through tubes, manage fluids, keep their bodies alive as long as we can. It's a prison, not an execution. A prison from which they cannot wake. They were already in one. We all are. This one at least serves a purpose." He looked away. "I became a doctor to mend people, not to turn them into walls. I became a soldier to keep wars in other people's countries, not to build dream cages on ancient ice. Yet here we are." He laughed once without humor. "You'll not choose the names yourself," he said. "You'll make it look like a medical decision. Old men, sick men, those already losing their minds. I'll let you suggest candidates. I'll also take volunteers. You think anyone will volunteer? Some might, if they believe it will save others." He shook his head, but he did not refuse. Pavel was harder. He stepped into my cabin when I called him, face lined, uniform creased. We had been through too many nights without real rest. "You want to tell me we are evacuating?" he began. "That the ministry approved an airlift?" "No. The storm makes that impossible for now, and the ministry moves at its own pace. We do not have the luxury of waiting." I explained the baffle plan in simpler terms. A ring of sedated men near the wall, their brains pulling the entity's focus into a tight loop, buying us time to move the rest away and seal off the area. "You cannot be serious. You want to plant men around that thing like fence posts." "Fence posts that think, that dream. The ancient builders found this works. We adjust their design with our tools. Those builders lived without aircraft and trains. If something got out, it spread slowly. We can move faster. We pull everyone back, radio for quarantine, bomb the site if we have to. And the men here who already host this thing in their dreams? You think they'll leave it behind when they climb onto a helicopter? You think it will respect the red lines on your map? He paced, fists opening and closing. You don't know your ring will hold. You don't know leaving men strapped to beds by the wall will do anything but feed this thing more. No. But I know the people who built the first wall were desperate and ingenious, and survived long enough for their work to fossilize. I know if we run without thinking, we risk turning this into a global problem. Doing nothing is not an option. You're choosing who lives and who dies. I always have. Command is a choice between deaths. He stopped pacing and stared at me. Do you include yourself in that ring? When you talk about sacrifice, do you mean yourself? My presence in this camp is worth more to the ministry alive. It was an admission, not an excuse. Disgust flickered in his eyes. I will not help you tie men down for this. I serve the state, but I am not one of your ghosts who vanish whole villages in the name of stability. If you refuse, this thing will find its way through you too. Then perhaps it should. Let it run wild here. Let it burn itself out in a remote camp where no one will mourn us. Better that than building another ring of prisoners. He turned toward the door. Pavel. I stepped forward. You will not send any message outside this camp without my approval. Not now. Not about this. If you try, I will stop you. Do you understand? He looked over his shoulder. You will not stop me from telling the truth forever. Not to the men here, not to your ministry. He left. I considered drawing my pistol for reasons other than a direct external threat. There was a version of this story where I put a bullet in his back as he walked away, then wrote a line in some report about an accident. That version of me still existed somewhere, in the gravity wells of old decisions. I did not choose it then. Instead, I moved faster. We started with 5 men. Not enough to form a full ring, but enough to test whether concentrating their dreams near the wall changed the pattern of incidents elsewhere. Arman identified them by combining my criteria with his own conscience. A scientist with severe breakdown, unable to distinguish dream from waking. An older worker with a heart condition who had already asked to be relieved. A communications operator who had confessed to planning to walk out into the snow in his sleep. The others had no special markers beyond reporting the giant dream almost every night. We moved them under the guise of enhanced observation. They went along because I presented it as treatment instead of sacrifice. We set up their beds in a half circle in the module closest to the wall, the one that had once held the equipment for cutting and cleaning the skulls. The bone fragments had been moved out. In their place, Arman's machines lined the walls, monitors, drip stands, portable brainwave readers. We attached electrodes to each man's scalp, wires running from their heads to the machines, and from there to a central improvised hub that Daniil, the communications specialist, cobbled together from spare parts. It's not really linking their brains, he muttered while tightening screws. But if we route their output signals into a feedback loop, we might create a resonance the entity can feel. If something behind the wall responds, we'll see it. And by giving it a bright cluster to focus on, we might keep it from reaching others. He did not look convinced, but he did not argue. When the men were sedated, I stood at the doorway and looked back at the wall through the observation window. It seemed closer now. The line of skulls loomed over the module like an audience. Their empty sockets stared down at the beds and the wires. For a moment, in the half-light, I thought I saw faint vibrations in the bone, like a distant drumhead reacting to a sound too low for our ears. Do you feel anything? Arman asked quietly. Yes, but that might just be my imagination. The first night with the partial baffle in place was not calm, but it was narrower. We still had incidents. Men woke trapped in nightmares, grabbing at their neighbors. One worker punched a bulkhead until his knuckles split. Another tried to climb the outer wall of a module, barefoot on icy metal, before a guard dragged him down. But there were no killings. No executions like Lukin's or Ura's. The entity seemed distracted, its reach blunted. Daniil watched the monitors through the night, eyes burning. The waveforms, he told me in the early hours when I checked in, they're synchronizing. It's like 5 separate people are dreaming the same dream at the same time. Before, the patterns overlapped sometimes. Now they're almost identical, and they spike whenever there is movement in the anomaly band on Victor's instruments. You're sure it's not just the overlay? He shook his head. Each trace still has its own channel. The similarity is real. Then the baffle is working. For now. The next day, the storm finally loosened its grip enough that we could reach the satellite again. The ministry responded to my earlier reports with a message full of cautious phrases: continue observation, avoid rash action, maintain operational capacity, await further directives. They had not read my latest updates yet. They did not know that I had already made the rash choice. I drafted a new message. Catastrophic structural destabilization of subject site, I wrote. Uncontrolled melt undermining area. Multiple fatalities due to environmental failure. High risk of subsurface collapse and potential release of unknown contaminants. Recommend complete evacuation of region and permanent cordon. Suggest formal classification as hazardous exclusion zone. No dreams, no giants. Contaminants and neurological stressors. I transmitted it on the secure channel without copying anyone else in. Then I went to find Pavel. He was in the small gym, punching a hanging bag with wrapped hands. Sweat soaked his shirt. He did not stop when I entered. You read the forecast? He asked between blows. Clear enough for a helicopter this evening, maybe tomorrow morning. I saw. I sent a recommendation to evacuate and cordon. He paused, gloves resting against the swaying bag. Recommending, he repeated. Not ordering, not declaring an emergency that forces their hand. You know as well as I do we don't order ministries, we advise. They decide. And if they decide in 2 days instead of 2 hours? He resumed, hitting the bag. How many more nights do you want your ring of prisoners running your experiment? Enough to build a buffer. Enough to give us a safe window to leave. He turned, eyes bright with anger. You already built it. You did it without approval. You turned men into hardware and told yourself you were being cautious. Yes. Because if I'd waited for a committee, the entity would have had more time to spread. Sometimes you act first, and seek forgiveness never. I'm sending a message of my own. On the open emergency channel, full details, dreams, sleepwalking, everything. Let the people in the cities decide if they want your baffle. You won't. He took a step toward the door. Pavel! He did not stop. The next moments compressed. I moved. My hand closed on his arm. He twisted, stronger than he looked, and we smashed into the wall. The hanging bag swung wildly. We crashed into the bench. His fist caught my ribs. I struck back with the panicked force of a man who had already decided this cannot be allowed. We landed hard. The floor under us was cold steel. He went for my throat. I felt his fingers dig in. Spots danced at the edge of my vision. For a moment, a different perspective intruded. High vantage, heavy limbs, prey under my hands. The entity leaned in, curious. I shoved that aside and moved. I twisted his wrist until his fingers spasmed open. I drove my thumb into the point under his jaw. He jerked, grip loosening. We scrambled to our feet, breathing hard. He swung. I ducked, felt the wind of his fist pass over my head. My own punch caught him in the side of the neck. He staggered, stumbled into the bench, lost his footing. His head struck the corner of a metal plate on the floor. He lay still. Blood spread slowly into his hair. I dropped to my knees beside him, fingers searching for a pulse. There was one. Weak, irregular. He was not dead. I yelled for a guard. Armin arrived within minutes with a stretcher and a tight mouth. We moved Pavel to the medical module. Armin's hands worked over him, checking pupils, lining up scans. He may live, he murmured. He may never wake. Or he may wake different. You don't get to know yet. I took the weight of those words and placed them beside the others in my head. A ledger of choices and their costs. I did not tell Armin why we had fought. He knew enough to guess. We added Pavel to the ring. It was not my idea. Armin made the choice, pushing back against his own conscience. He's in a coma, the doctor told me. His brain shows activity, but he cannot respond. That makes him exactly what your plan requires. If we're going to do this, he's one more body between that thing and the rest of us. He did not have to say what he really meant. This way, the man I had put on a stretcher might serve a purpose beyond lying in a bed and raging in silence. We wheeled Pavel into the baffle module and set his bed at the apex of the curve, closest to the wall. Electrodes on his scalp, drip line in his arm, monitors beeping with each beat of his heart. The ring felt more complete. That night, I slept in my cabin with the pistol on the table, not because I feared an outside attack, but because some reflex wanted a solid object near my hand. The dream came as always. The bone tunnels stretched ahead, curving around the central emptiness. The sleepers in their niches twitched as their nightmares ran. I walked among them, mind divided between my own thoughts and something else moving through me. When I reached one niche, I recognized the face immediately. Pavel. Younger, unmarked, but unmistakably him. His skull was open at the back. Rods slid into his brain, connecting it to the grooves in the wall. His eyes were closed, but his brows knotted in pain. I reached out and touched his forehead. Something moved behind the wall. Not physically, not in a way a camera could record, but in the space where perception and instinct met. It noticed my attention. It recognized me now as more than just one of many dreamers. The frequency of my presence had marked me as a stable feature. It spoke in its own way. Not words, not images, an invitation, a sense of offer. If I allowed it, it would give me clearer glimpses. It would show me where outbreaks would occur, who would break, how far it could reach if I loosened certain restraints. In return, I would adjust the camp in ways that fed it. More fear here, more desperation there, more concentrated nightmares at the wall. A partnership. I had been in that role before. The man between the ministry and the disaster, welcomed by both as a tool. For a moment I almost took it. The logic was compelling. If I could predict every outbreak, I could prevent more deaths. If I fed it in measured doses, maybe it would grab less wildly. Then another thought arrived. Harder. The entity did not think in compromise. It thought in paths. It would use me until I was empty, then slide along whatever channels I opened. I had spent my life as a conduit for orders I did not write. I recognized the shape of that use. I withdrew my hand from Pavel's dream face. The rods in his skull quivered, but I did not push them deeper. The entity's attention slipped off me, annoyed. It shifted to the ring, pressing along the grooves of 5, 6, 7 minds instead. Their dream pulses brightened, running in loops. I woke sweating despite the cold. The next morning, the camp was unnervingly quiet. No new injuries, no fresh killings. Men moved through their tasks like sleepwalkers of a different kind, exhausted but functioning. The only irregularity was a sense of pressure, as if something pressed against the edges of the walls without quite breaking through. Daniil met me outside the baffle module, eyes wide behind his glasses. "You need to see this," he urged. The brainwave traces from the sedated men had tightened into a near-perfect alignment. Their patterns rose and fell together, peaks overlapping like teeth. The combined signal on the central screen showed a slow, looping rhythm with occasional spikes. "Anytime there's minor activity anywhere else in the camp," Daniil said, "this trace spikes instead. It's pulling the interference into itself. And the anomaly band behind the wall." He pointed to another screen patched into Victor's instruments. The band glowed faintly, with small pulses that matched the spikes in the baffle trace. It responds, and then settles. It's like we've given it a toy to occupy its hands. For how long? I wondered. Armin hovered near the beds, checking drips, adjusting electrodes. His face was drawn. "You've bought us time," he conceded. "That's all. These bodies will fail eventually. Muscles will waste, lungs will weaken, something will give. And before that happens, we leave." We organized the evacuation in 2 stages. The first wave would be the least affected men, those who had experienced the dreams rarely or not at all. They would travel with minimal personnel from security and science to the nearest airstrip, under orders to say as little as possible about what had happened. The second wave would include those with stronger dream histories, and any remaining staff needed to manage the baffle. Ideally, there would be no second wave. The ministry might decide to treat the entire site as lost and deny further access. I placed myself in the second wave. That was my compromise with my own conscience. I would not be one of the first to run. I would stay until those least entangled were away. After that, I would reassess. The first convoy left at dusk in 2 tracked vehicles and a snowcrawler. Timur drove one. His familiarity with the land made him essential, and he had not been as affected by the dreams as others. He glanced once at the skull wall as he climbed into the cab, then focused on the route ahead. Daniil stayed. He refused to leave his machines. "You need someone who understands this setup if it starts to fail," he told me. "Victor can read his instruments from anywhere, but he cannot splice a cable to save his life. You could die here. I could die on the road. At least here I know which monster I'm staring at." I did not argue. That night, as the first convoy crawled away into the white, I stood at the observation window of the baffle module and watched the skull wall. In the faint light, the bone surfaces seemed to move. Not literally. That would have been simple. Instead, my mind overlaid old images on new ones. I saw ancient giants chained in place, their heads fitted into gaps, their skulls wired into carved grooves. I saw smaller men, some with features that could have been ours with slight changes, directing the process with tools in their hands and hard set to their jaw. I wondered what arguments they had faced, who had refused, who had volunteered, who had been forced. Did any of them stand as I did now, watching the wall and wondering if they had done the right thing, knowing they would never get a clear answer? The entity pressed against the inner band. The baffle held, for the moment. When sleep came for me that night, it did so without sedatives. The dream began with me standing inside the camp, not the bone tunnel. Men moved through the corridors, their faces blurred. The skull wall loomed beyond the modules, a broken arc of bone. Above it, the sky stretched blank as always. A vibration rose that rattled the metal under my feet and set the skulls ringing like thin bells. The men looked up, startled. Some grabbed at their heads, others dropped to their knees. A few started walking toward the wall as if pulled. I stood alone, unaffected. The vibration passed through me without catching. In the distance, beyond the arc of the wall, something shifted in the snow. Not rising, not taking form, simply moving. Like a sleeper under a blanket turning over. The scene jumped. I was back in the bone tunnel, moving faster now, almost running. The sleepers in their niches trembled. Some of their faces were unfamiliar. Others I knew very well. Armin, Daniil, even Timur, though I had imagined him far away. Rods slid into their brains like hooks. Their dream pulses flared. I tried to slow my pace. I could not. The giant body I wore moved on rails, following a route it had traced 1,000 times. The entity pressed its impulse through me, testing. If I agreed, if I relaxed one mental barrier, it would use me to choose new niches, new sleepers to wire into the wall. I could select those whose loss would hurt least. The decision would be mine, not some blind forces. I stopped. I reached out and gripped the wall itself instead of a sleeper. My enormous fingers dug into the bone grooves. I felt the vibrations under the surface. The entity pushed back, annoyed by the interruption. It tried to slide around my grip, but the ancient wiring had not been built for resistance. It had been built for flow. I wrenched. The bone cracked under my hands. A section of the inner tunnel wall broke free, shattering rods and severing connections. Light flared in the gap, not mystical, just a bare awareness of something less contained. The entity's attention snapped away from me and back to the circle of sleepers, trying to re-establish its limits. The baffle took the strain and screamed without sound. I woke with my hands clenched so hard my fingernails had dug into my palms. Blood welled in red crescents. For a moment, lying there in the dark, I considered acting on what I had done in the dream. Destroy the wall. Bring the whole structure down. Use explosives on the skulls. Collapse the anomaly band inward. Bury the entity deeper under ice and rock. But even as the idea formed, I saw the flaws. We did not have enough charges to guarantee a full collapse. The shock might break the ancient restraints without sealing anything. The entity might surge outward along whatever new fractures we created. Destruction was tempting because it felt decisive. In my experience, it rarely delivered the clean ending men wanted. Morning brought more practical news. The first convoy had reached the airstrip. A helicopter would ferry them to the nearest major base. The ministry had acknowledged my evacuation recommendation and ordered a second stage, contingent on further assessment of site conditions. In other words, they were hedging. I gave them a simplified picture of the baffle's effect. I described it as a temporary increase in neurological load near the wall, resulting in decreased incidents elsewhere in the camp. I did not detail the moral cost. Recommend maintaining current configuration until second convoy departs, I wrote. After that, site should be considered too unstable for further human presence. Enforce permanent exclusion. I knew some board in a city would argue about that. They would want more teams, more instruments, more eyes. But casualties, equipment damage, and an undefined neurological risk would scare some of them into caution. Fear could be harnessed for containment too. We prepared the second convoy. It would be smaller, slower. Fewer vehicles remained in reliable condition. The path out had been churned by the first convoy, but the weather had shifted again, filling ruts, smoothing tracks. The men who would leave now included some who still struggled with the dreams. We could not wait for a clean line between affected and unaffected. That line did not exist. In the end, I chose to stay. Not because I had found some noble vein of self-sacrifice, but because I could not trust anyone else to write the final report in a way that contained as much of this thing as possible in words. There is a certain arrogance in that decision. I recognize it. Daniil refused to go as well. So did Armin. So did Victor. So did Timur, when he returned with the empty vehicles and learned what we intended. "Someone has to keep an eye on you," the guide muttered. "Men like you make big choices. Someone from the land should be here to see them." We were too few to form another convoy. The last vehicles went out with the last group of men we could spare. That left us with the camp, the skull wall, the baffle ring, and whatever time remained before bodies failed or ministries changed their minds. The days blurred. We maintained the sedated men as best we could. We patched leaks, monitored machines, watched the brainwave traces with the focus of gamblers following a game. We slept in shifts, dreams now so saturated with giant hunts and bone tunnels that they barely registered as unusual. Incidents in the rest of the camp dwindled. The entity's attention stayed mostly on the ring. As the sedated men's bodies weakened, the waveforms grew erratic. Each time one flatlined, we watched Victor's anomaly band for signs of change. The entity pressed harder after each loss. It tested the edges of the baffle, pushing against the grooves like water against a dam. We replaced dead sleepers when we could, drawing on the shrinking pool of conscious men. Occasionally, one of us volunteered. More often we argued and then made the choice anyway. One morning I walked into the baffle module and found Timur sitting on the edge of an empty bed, looking at the wall. "These skulls will outlast us," he remarked. "They watched the last people fail. They will watch us too. You don't have to do this, I told him, knowing it was half true at best. I know. He lay back, arms at his sides. That is why I will. We wired him in. The days after that blurred further. My notes became more fragmented. Reports to the ministry shorter, more abstract. I focused on the essentials. The ring was holding for now. The anomaly band was active but contained. The camp was no longer viable for ongoing operations. Permanent exclusion remained the only responsible course. Eventually, the ministry agreed. Site designated restricted hazard zone, their message read. All remaining personnel to return as soon as practicable. No further access permitted without high-level approval. They did not ask about the men in the baffle. They assumed, I think, that everyone would leave. We could not evacuate them without breaking the ring entirely and inviting the entity to ride our convoy back to the world. We could not keep them alive indefinitely either. The only honest statement was that their lives were already over in any meaningful sense. Armin refused to abandon them. Daniil refused to abandon his machines. Victor refused to abandon his data. Each offered reasons that had more to do with who they were than with the situation. I am not going back to a hospital in the city knowing I left a man from my ward hooked to a wall, Armin declared. I do not care what your ministry thinks is acceptable. You'll die here. Everyone dies somewhere. This place already owns most of me. In the end, compromise found us again. It always does. We set up a smaller ring. We could not maintain all the sleepers forever, but we might maintain a subset long enough to give the world a buffer of years. My reports to the ministry framed our departure as complete. My private decisions framed it as partial. We chose a handful of men who were already deeply entangled with the dream, whose chances of returning to any kind of normal life were slim. They would remain wired in, bodies supported by whatever automated systems we could rig. Solar panels on the roofs, small turbines, battery banks, enough to keep the machines running for a while. Then we left. The last journey out of the camp felt unreal. We walked instead of driving, packs on our backs, weapons slung. The vehicles had already done their last work. The ground under us was treacherous, sinking patches, ice ridges, but clear enough if you watched your footing. The skull wall shrank behind us with each step, then disappeared over a rise. I did not look back. In the first settlement we reached with a functioning terminal. I filed my final report, stripped of the details that would make any curious official want to go back. Permafrost melt destabilizing region, it read. Anomalous structure at site too fragile and hazardous for further study. Recorded neuropsychological effects on personnel consistent with severe stress and unknown environmental factors. Strongly advise permanent cordon and no return. The ministry rubber-stamped it. Back in the city, they gave me a commendation for handling a difficult situation with minimal broader impact. The piece of paper carried an official seal and some phrases about diligence and sacrifice. It mentioned nothing about giants or dreams. I sat in my apartment one evening and watched the light on the screen reflect off the glass of the frame. The weight of the commendation in my hand did not match the weight of the invisible bodies wired into beds thousands of kilometers away. At night, I still dream. Not every night. Enough. Sometimes I find myself back in the giant body, moving under the low sky, chasing small figures across the snow. Sometimes I walk the bone tunnel, past niches where sleepers lie wired into the wall. Those faces have changed. Many are strangers. Some, I suspect, are the men we left at the camp. They do not look at me. They do not know I stand there. Their dreams belong to the entity now. Sometimes, in those dreams, I feel a new pressure at the edge of the ring, like a tide testing a levee. The baffle holds. For now. I wake with my hands closed around the air, fingers remembering the feel of a body that is not there. I open them slowly, one by one, until I can see each knuckle, each scar. The ministry sends me requests for consultation on other projects, chemical plants near old borders, underground storage sites, derelict bases thawing out of ice. They trust my experience. They trust that I know how to keep trouble inside its box. I read each file and ask myself the same question. If something climbs out of this box, will I build another wall of heads to jam it back in? I cannot answer honestly until I stand on the ground and feel how heavy the choice is. In the quiet moments between assignments, I think of the skull wall. It is still there, under its blank sky. The baffle we built runs along its inner edge, a fragile necklace of dreaming men. Machines whir and click around them until parts wear out, until panels corrode, until time undoes my work as it undid the work of the smaller hunters before us. One day, the power will fail. The last sleeper's heart will stutter and stop. The entity will find itself alone in the ring, with no more toys to occupy its hands. Maybe by then the world will have changed enough that it cannot find a path into our minds. Maybe not. When I close my eyes, the image that stays is simple. A huge hand, mine and not mine, closing around a running figure. The feeling of bones giving under pressure. The choice to squeeze or not to squeeze. In the end, that is all containment is. You decide whose neck you put your fingers around, and you live with the memory of how it felt.